What is up, everybody? This is Chris with New to the Game, and I'm here with my co-host Ben Schneider. Welcome to the next episode of the podcast. It's been a few minutes. We've been a little bit hit and miss with getting these episodes recorded, but we are excited today to talk to you about something that both me and Ben are pretty passionate about. We are going to be talking about New Year's goal planning, and not the stereotypical, like, we're going to go to the gym on January 1st goal planning, because that's silly. We're going to be talking about kind of wrapping up your year and looking at what you're doing right now and helping yourself create a vision or goal set or list of tasks and goals for the new year. Both business, might get into some personal as well, but usually as a business owner, those things are pretty tied together. So we're going to jump right in. This episode's going to be pretty conversational. It's not going to be a typical, like, sit here, list of questions, ask each other type of podcast. It's going to be a lot more conversational. So we're going to see where it goes. Ben, I guess to start, what are your thoughts on this as a big picture as a whole? Like, when you're wrapping up your year as a business owner and you're looking at the data, you're looking at the revenue, you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at yourself, you're looking at what next year is going to look like, where do you start?
Yeah. So I'm the type who I love goal planning. Like you could ask my wife like 100 times over. I really enjoy this time of year. My business tends to really slow down this time of year. So not only that, but like it creates a lot of bandwidth for me to give this a lot of attention. So at the high level, I love to begin my process of goal planning around data. I'm just very, very data driven. So normally my gut instinct when I'm looking at, okay, what do I want to do next year? Well, the best, most helpful thing that I can do is look at the metrics of this year and essentially try to pull up all those different areas where I might be able to identify growth opportunities. But then that sort of bridges once you do a lot of data collection and you say, okay, these are growth opportunities. These are probably patterns that will continue into next year. Like, let's just say maybe it's like a sales closing ratio or something like that. That's probably going to carry into next year. So I can measure my overarching goal, like revenue goal or something, and I can kind of backwards track it from my sales closing ratio and how many leads I need to get, that type of thing. So that's more on the data side. But then on the other side, when it comes to kind of like being a little bit more of just a true visionary, and this can be obviously applied to personal and professional, but for professional, being a visionary is really starting to ask yourself the question, like, where do I want to be at this point next year? Where am I at right now? Where was I at a year ago? Based upon that trajectory or based upon the different evolutions I've experienced, where does the person that I am right now want to be a year from now? And so I like to start with a lot of some of those, I don't know, maybe ambiguous type of questions first, because those give me a little bit of creative freedom to kind of see where my head is at. And normally this is like a multi-day, multi-week process of me just kind of playing with the data and allowing this goal to unravel itself. So ideally by year end or by early January, I have a pretty well laid out goal. I have a budget for that goal. I have KPI targets for that goal. I have hiring goals. I have personal goals. Like all of it is kind of tied together in this really big package. And that's sort of generally been the way that I really, really like to approach it.
Awesome. So we spent a bunch of time in previous episodes talking about knowing your numbers, how to collect data, what KPIs look like, what tracking looks like. So I don't really want to dig into like what that looks like, because I feel like we've already done that, and I feel like that's kind of off topic today. But super, super short, brief version for all of you guys listening. If you have not started that, or if you're a new listener and you haven't listened to our previous episodes, go back and before you start thinking about what do I want to do this next year, figure out how to collect that data. Because like Ben said, I'm very similar where I have very specific goals of like, what do I want my revenue to look like? What do I want my crews to look like? What do I want my office staff to look like? What do I want my net profit to look like? What do I want personally? And I usually, like Ben said, I start with data. So if you do not know how to collect data, if you don't know what data points are important, if you don't know where to start with that, go back and look at our previous episodes. Listen to the episodes that we have from previously in the podcast about collecting KPIs, collecting data, and tracking that stuff. So that'll give you a good starting point of like what you should be looking at and what information is probably going to help you make some of these decisions. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in the same boat where like I'm I'm try to start thinking about this stuff in like October and November. I don't have a set date on the calendar or anything, but like so my one of my colleagues, he likes to phrase this as get a running start at the new year. So like you imagine you're towing the line for a marathon, and you imagine if you're standing at the starting line and you're waiting for that clock to tick down to midnight on New Year's Eve, and then you start running January 1st, and you're cramped up, you're not warmed up yet. It takes you a couple of miles to get warmed up. So by the time you really get into the nitty-gritty of all this, you look up and it's February. Whereas what I like to do is I like to start thinking about planning and even working on my 2025 goals towards the end of the year. And that way, like, instead of starting at that starting line January 1st, I'm like already running. And I just run past January 1st and keep going. And I feel like doing that every year just kind of makes me feel like I'm a little bit ahead, which I know it sounds silly. I mean, it's like those classic motivational memes where it's like, don't start January 1st, start today. Raw. And I feel like that's just a mindset thing for me where I try to start thinking about this stuff early. So I guess let's talk about how we actually do this, I guess, to start off with, because I think a lot of people, when you say, hey, what are your goals for next year, they might be really abstract. So talk to me about how specific your goals are for next year, like whatever ones you've come up with already. You can get into granular if you want to, but just talk to me about like where you start with that and what specific things you're usually writing down or tracking or thinking about, and why those are the most important to you.
Yeah, so it's okay. So I'll start with the principle behind it and then kind of go into the more like exact how. But the principle behind it is it's sort of, I would say it ties really nicely with what you just said, but it's this is starting with the bigger picture typically. Like you have a bigger picture and you kind of backwards dissect it from there. But then on the flip side of that, in the same regard as planning, so the planning methodology is the same as like you go big picture and then you go backwards from it, but then it comes to also being on the forefront of it. It's like how many obstacles are in the way that you need to address, or maybe you can proactively address so that you can have a smooth flowing operation when you actually really, when it really counts. It's like this simple example of like, I lay my clothes out before I wake up in the morning, or at night before I wake up in the morning, because I realize that like it's an obstacle for me to get up out of bed and have to pick out my clothes in the pitch black dark because my wife is still sleeping, and I'm like it's like one of those like annoying little things that I do. So if I lay it out, I don't have to do that, and that's easy. So in the same realm, I think that's speaking to what you just said. It's very, very important to be proactive with this, because proactivity very, very much inspires and permits you to be able to flow when it comes down to it, when you get into the point of performance, essentially. Speaking on the more like tactical of this, like how does it actually look when we're sitting down? I mean, my one of my favorite exercises that I worked on with a coach quite a bit in the past year, and I did this multiple times over the course of the year, and it was often kind of like an end of year, beginning of year type of exercise. Is I literally will sit down with pen and paper, and I start to. I'm a very verbal processor, so when you give me a pen and paper, what it permits me to do is essentially like throw up all of my thoughts onto that paper and just kind of have this brain dump right in front of me. So that's an extremely helpful exercise. It's extremely helpful to be able to sit down and kind of just get it all out of you. That's like I would consider that to be kind of step one. And normally I would say do that multiple times over. One of the fun exercises is to sit down and say, okay, in one page, if I had one page to write this, let me take maybe give yourself a time limit and say 5 minutes. Let me write down every single thing that I want for myself in the next, I don't know, year, or where do I want to be in a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, and just write it out. And then do that exercise at different points in time, multiple times over, 3 or 4 times, 5 times, however many you want, and start to identify overlapping trends that you see within each of those things. Like you call them core desires when you're kind of just throwing all this stuff up. And it's really fascinating because it helps you get a little bit more perspective into what you actually want compared to maybe a lot of the kind of temporary stuff that isn't as critical to you, but it's just like, oh yeah, I want a bike or I want a car or something like that. You can actually get a little bit more detailed with it and be like, I want something that makes me feel super comfortable or makes me feel super alive or makes me feel like at peace with my life. Like whatever it is, you can kind of start to dissect those a little bit. But what about you? I mean, with your perspective, the way you approach things, I've always really admired the way that you've approached things, because you have a very the way that it seems like your mind goes about it is that you're like getting deep into the weeds of things. And if someone allows you and gives you, if you give yourself the permission to go deep, you will just continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you get a very, very thorough layout to how you kind of develop these goals. So what on your end, how would do you have a set process that you typically work through with that, or is it normally kind of much of what we're talking about where you're kind of just throwing a lot of stuff out all at once and then hoping you pull good things out of it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say I kind of do both actually, because what I do is I start with the exact same process. So I start with I just take a dump of my brain on paper of all the stuff I'm thinking about, and I don't try to get very specific or granular about it. I drop stuff like sales goal, revenue goal, like what I want to do with certain things. But I think one of the things that I probably do a little bit differently is I try to end up with really specific goals. Because one of the things that I know that for me, if I don't get specific enough, I I don't track or think about the progress as easily. So, for as an example, if I just say like, "Hey, I want to sell $1 million next year," that's a goal for a lot of clients, and a lot of other contractors and a lot of other people that are starting companies. Like, I want to get to that seven figures mark, and I think that for me, I have to know why that number exists. So, like we've talked about things being data driven. So this is a really easy, specific example of like I like my goal for next year is I actually have a sales goal by quarter because I plan on growing in the next year. So it's hard for me to look at next year and say I want to do 800K in net, like gross revenue and 150 in net profit or any specific number because I'm probably going to add a third crew in the spring or summer and upstaff in the office and dial up marketing strategies and things like that. So what I have is I have a $300,000 gross revenue goal between quarter one and quarter two. And then I have a 4 to 500K gross revenue goal in quarter three and quarter four. So I could look at it and say, like, hey, I want to sell $800,000 next year. Or I should say produce $800,000 next year. I probably need to sell closer to $1 million if I want my beginning of the year booked out like it was this year. But I think that being a little bit more specific about it is important for me because I know that if I say, hey, I want to sell 800K next year, I'm going to feel like I'm way behind in June and not feel like I'm caught up until September, November, December, later in the year. So another example would be like I know that I want to add another crew, and what I have done is I've kind of narrowed that down specifically to I want to hire another apprentice in quarter one, and then I want to either hire another experienced employee or complete one of my apprentices training by the end of quarter two, with the goal of by quarter three, like by mid to late summer, I'd like to have a third crew running and off the ground. That also looks like buying new vehicles because I've had the goal since the middle of last year to get the two older beat up work vehicles that my crews are driving right now replaced by middle of next year. And the rigs we're running right now work. They make us money. They drive down the road, but they're old, they're beat up, they have maintenance issues, and they don't look as nice as I'd like. So I have that specific goal of buying or leasing or whatever two new work trucks by the end of quarter three, ideally by the end of quarter two. And one of those two vehicles we currently have that those vehicles would replace would become that third cruise vehicle until we can afford to buy a third one. So I have all that written down just because even though it's really specific and a little bit granular, it just helps me wrap my head around like what I'm looking at for the next 6, 9, 12 months. Some other really specific things is like I hired and onboarded my VA. That was one of my goals for quarter four of this year. My quarter one goals include that VA being fully trained, and then by the end of quarter one, hiring a second VA specifically for finance. So I'm looking for somebody that's going to be doing bookkeeping, kind of like a miniature CFO in a lot of ways. So either part time or full time. I haven't decided on that yet. Either part time to full time, depending on the person, the candidate, the amount of work they do, and what their responsibilities entail. But I'm looking at having them hired by the end of January and trained and onboarded by the end of quarter one. And I've got a lot of goals like that. And I think that for me, a lot of it stems from like, where do I want to be by the end of next year or in 3 years? And I'm kind of trying to take steps towards where I want to be in 2 or 3 years in quarter one or in quarter two or in quarter three.
Yeah.
So kind of on that, kind of
That's a
on,
good point. Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, kind of on that note, like that's one of the things I was going to ask you is like, for those listening, how much do you directly tie what you're working on right now to what you want to do in a year or 3 years or 5 years? I know we kind of talked before the show started about like a lot of people will tell you like, oh, you need to create like a 20-year vision or a 10-year vision or a 30-year vision or whatever the book you're reading says. But like what level of depth do you go into for looking down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I've always really appreciated the perspective. So one of my coaches is Mike Claudio with Win Rate, and he has a really great perspective on this because I think there are often many people who will look at it and they see their goal and they want he uses a mountain. So the mountain, we'll just say Mount Everest, for example. Like Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, massive mountain, crazy, huge, ambitious goal to climb to the top. But the reality is that you don't climb to the top in one day. I mean, you've recently done a mountain climb, and I mean, there are base camps. You get to a base camp, you stop, you stay, you refresh, and then you go to the next base camp. And the journey, instead of the journey to the top, it's the journey to the next base camp. So I'm a huge fan of that principle because for me, it's about what is your, like you said, what is your 2 to 3 year goal? And then, yeah, maybe you have like a super, super, like kind of out there vision for what the big mountain looks like, maybe, but like let's just be honest and real with ourselves. Our lives are an ever evolving thing. To really feel like we have the capacity to say I'm going to determine exactly where I'm going to be in 30 years can be lofty, to be fair. And I'm not saying that's incorrect or wrong, but I'm thinking I would want to communicate that there are many steps that you're going to need to take in order to be able to get there, and your time is better spent more often than not at identifying those steps than only fixing your eyes at the peak of the mountaintop. So the way that I look at this is, for me, 2 to 3 year goals. I want to build my company. I want to have a team, a sales team. Like for my longest time, I've been the only salesperson within my company. We're hiring a salesperson in Q1 of 2025, which I'm super excited about. But then if I'm hiring a salesperson, I also am going to need to increase our production capacity. So the natural trajectory of our company over 2 to 3 years is going to involve building teams, building around people, maybe building new departments for the company that have never really truly existed, or maybe it's like one person has fulfilled multiple roles within each department. So yeah, my vision there is that's in a lot of ways the vision is to make a more complete and holistic company structure than what has formerly just kind of been a small business and like myself and a few other people making this thing work. So when it comes to how I approach that, though, it's really important for me to be able to identify the mission. I think you've probably heard people say, like, oh, have a mission, core values, and stuff like that. Those conversations are very tied together quite often. The reason that I find that so important is because if you have the lens of the mission that you're after, so in this case, I would describe your mission as what is your next base camp. Identify that. Try to get as granular as you want. Of course, leave room for ambiguity, but at the end of the day, like you can get a pretty detailed vision. Like I want to be a $5 million company. I want to have X number of employees. I want to do this type of work or something like that. This is what maybe I want my day to look like. Like I don't want to be doing 40 hours of sales appointments every week anymore or something of that nature. So you can identify that stuff. Once you have that lens, you can then begin to establish more regular and routine initiatives out of that. So, the super common approach would be using a SWOT analysis. You highlight your strengths, you highlight your weaknesses, you highlight your opportunities, and you identify your threats. After you've done that, you review all of those. So you might have 5 to 10 in each one of those categories in every area of your company. I like to approach it departmentally. So I'll say, okay, what are the SWOT of my production? What's the SWOT of my sales? What's the SWOT of my marketing? We then bring those together. And after we've kind of assessed where those are, again, looking through the lens of our mission, like where are we wanting to be able to take ourselves, we can then start to say, okay, out of these strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, what are the things that we can pull out of this that might be really tangible opportunities that we can achieve during this next quarter. Again, this sort of like, you can have a yearly goal in this to some degree, but the quarterly goal here is really critical, because the quarterly is like the most actionable period of time that you're going to achieve the most amount of things. So I really love the view of the quarter, because I think it's a really healthy progress metric. So as you're looking at that, you could say maybe it's your sales, and you have an issue with sales. So maybe there's like a really low closing ratio. It's probably an opportunity there, or maybe we'll say that's from the weakness category. You would establish an initiative around that says, build a more holistic sales process that achieves a higher closing ratio, or maybe build some form of automations into my system, maybe do a training for sales, and you can kind of start to dissect it a little bit more closely. That's sort of it. Again, going more away from the goal mindset and going more towards kind of the habit mindset that you'll read in books like Atomic Habits and the others, where it's
Mhm.
like 1% better every single day. I love to kind of marry those two together, because I love to have goals, but I also love to be able to focus my primary attention. So my day-to-day attention, especially once, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, once the race has begun, I like for my efforts to be simply focused on my pace. I don't like to focus my efforts on goal planning and constantly working and worrying about all these goals and just working towards this one single goal. I like to identify, what is my pace going to look like during the course of the next quarter, and then the following quarter, and then the following quarter. And if I can maintain that pace throughout the entire course of the year, the likelihood of me actually achieving that goal just goes X up, because the reality
Mhm.
is, had I only been focused on that one goal and I hadn't really take the time to to identify what pace looked like, most people in the situation, especially high performing entrepreneurs like ourselves, tend to get burnt out rapidly, and it very, very rarely is going to
Mhm.
lead to a fulfilling achievement of that goal. And even if you do achieve that goal, you are burnt out and you have sacrificed way more than what would have been necessary on the journey to it.
Yeah. No, and I love that thought process. I mean, as you know, like a lot of what I'm doing right now revolves around building our companies and building my companies, especially when I'm thinking about my personal goals for this next year or two, so that we have the same amount of money coming in or more. Our company is just as healthy. Our company is growing, but that we have more and more and more time to focus on designing and delegating and building out our companies and not just doing tasks. And so I know for me, a lot of the goals that I'm looking at, like I pulled up my document that I have, because while I do love pen and paper, I've been going back and forth a lot over the years with putting things on a computer screen versus putting things on paper. And what I found is that if I stick to one system for the last 6 months to a year, I've found that computer works the best for me, just so that I can pull up my phone, make a note, put it away when I'm thinking about it. Because I have the kind of ADD where I have ridiculous amounts of random inspiration that come to me at odd hours of the day, but then if I don't write something down, it disappears.
Oh, it's the worst.
So
Absolute worst.
yeah, so I've joked all the time that I should get one of those little tape recorder buttons you see from people in the 90s in movies, where it's like, "Hey, remember to do this." And then at the end of the day, I'm just gonna, like, press play and write it all down, but that'd be a little bit ridiculous. But no, so, like, I'm looking at my goals next year, and, like, a lot of my goals revolve around, how can I delegate portions of my daily responsibilities without giving away my ability to solidly produce those duties? Because as you know, and as a lot of the listeners know, when I was talking about my old company, I made the mistake of delegating tasks without delegating ownership and authority. So I I'm reading this book right now called Clockwork by Mike Moskowitz. I always forget how to say his last name, but the guy that wrote Profit First.
Yeah. Like
That's his
McAllowitz or
famous book.
something.
Is he? Yeah, McAllowitz or something. It starts with an M. Mike. I just call him Mike.
I'll look it up for you and you can talk.
Okay. And I'm reading his book called Clockwork, which it's kind of like tailored for those companies that are in the spot that we're in, where they are not a startup, they're not a new business, but they're not at the point where they're like rapidly scaling and growing like their 20 or 30 employee company. So it's kind of that middle weird transition ground of like you're bringing in revenue, you're making money, you're making profit, you're training people, you're onboarding people, but you're not to the point of systemization where the owner is not involved in like many, if not all, facets of the company. So one of the craziest things that book talks about is I have a checklist on my wall now, and one of the goals I've set long term is in 18 months, which for me currently would be summer of 2026, me and my entire family are going to take a 3-week vacation, and we're going to drive all over the Western US and go on a road trip, go to national parks, go to Disneyland. And my biggest goal that I have right now is to be able to take that trip without having my phone. And that's a little bit crazy when you say it out loud, because that sounds absolutely psychotic. But I don't think that I will actually truly 100% disconnect. But the goal that I have is to, in 18 months from now, have my company at a point where my predominant job in the company is to design, delegate, make decisions, and shape the company's future and grow and build systems, hire and retain and train people, and not physically do the work. So the clockwork system that it talks about in the book is all about changing whether you're doing, deciding, delegating, what exactly you're doing every day. And one of the things they have you do is track all your time and look at how you're doing things every day and what percentage of your day are you doing a task that you could train and hire somebody to do versus what percentage of the day are you designing the future of your company. And a lot of my goals revolve around that. So like hiring my admin VA to handle a lot of the day-to-day petty admin tasks is part of that. Hiring more field crew employees so that I can have more crew leads trained by next year is part of that. Looking at hiring a CFO, bookkeeper / finance type person to help run KPIs, numbers, data, reports, and tracking is part of that. Empowering my employees to take on more duties in the field and training my employees to talk to each other instead of always just talking to me is part of that. But I think what it all circles back to is like, you'll probably totally relate to this, but how many times have you delegated a task, but then in order to finish that task, that employee has to ask you 47 questions because they're not sure that you're going to approve of the way that they're going to complete that task? What percentage of the
Oh yeah,
time would you say when you delegate a task that happens?
not as much anymore. But man, I
Yeah.
have
Maybe think
unfortunately
back
had
to like a
to
year
go down
or
that
two
rabbit hole.
ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know
yeah,
that's
a
a
year or
rabbit hole.
two ago.
You
Yeah,
don't have to answer that question.
yeah.
But I think any business owner listening who's hired employees and is maybe not quite at the point of like comfortability we are with letting go will relate to that. And what Mike talks about in his book Clockwork is that if you are doing something, so the first D, you're doing the task. Obviously, you hold ownership for the task, hold ownership for the outcome, and deciding how that outcome is going to happen. Whereas if you decide the outcome, but then give that task to somebody else, that truly isn't delegating. You're just giving them the task and you're deciding how it's going to be done and telling somebody else to do it. So you're basically just having a TaskRabbit employee that does all these things that you tell them to do, but you're still deciding what's going to happen and you still hold responsibility and ownership for the outcome. Whereas when you truly delegate something, you also have to delegate the authority to make decisions about how it's going to be done. And you have to delegate the ownership of what the outcome looks like. So instead of delegating hey, I need you to, I need you to inventory all of the equipment we have in the shop and give me a list. Delegating the outcome and delegating the authority would look more like, hey, we need a really good understanding of all of the equipment we have in the shop so that we can appropriately assign the right equipment to the right crews. We need to know the serial numbers and photos of everything so that we have records and documents for insurance. We need to have maintenance records on all the tools so that we keep things in good working order. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're effectively managing our inventory so that we are being efficient with money, cost, expenditure, and time for guys picking up, dropping off tools, having equipment break on jobs, lost revenue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you explain all that to an employee, and that employee now takes ownership of that duty. And they don't have to ask you like, hey, so I did this, but do I need to do that? because they already know. They hold ownership for the outcome. And I know that's kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole, not 100% on topic, but I think it's relevant when you're talking about this stuff because for a lot of us as business owners, we are trying to decide when we set goals what exactly our company is going to look like. And I know for me in the next 2 or 3 years, that's going to look like a lot of delegating, hiring, recruiting, and retention. Because I know that I want to be at a point where I am not the one that has to be where the buck stops for everything. But I also don't want to make the mistake I made in my last company of putting people in a position where they have a job, but they feel like they need to ask me how to do their job every day because they don't have the appropriate trainings, systems, or authority to do it without talking to me first. So like when you're hiring your sales guy, I'm sure you're thinking about that. When I had my old company, I had a sales guy who I still did half of his job. I had an operations manager who I still did half of his job. I had crew leads and field techs. I was still doing half their job, and it just didn't work. Part of the reason my old company didn't do as well as it should have.
I think you're making a really good point too. And I mean, to sort of bring it full circle with that, you just identified the goal, and the goal being to get to the point where you can delegate more freely. So what does pace for that goal look like? I would identify it as like that is the process of developing processes. That's the process of getting in there and developing the SOPs, the standard operating procedures, identifying what KPIs that person's going to be responsible for, getting a lot of the documentation taken care of, identifying like what are the core values of the company. So that way, when I have someone else make the decisions in this situation, are they going to make decisions in alignment with what the core values of the company are? And so
Exactly.
if you don't have those things explicitly in place, you're creating an opportunity for you to be able to identify, okay, if I have this hour block or 2 hour block or whatever that the window of time is that you spend, especially newer business owners, I realize you're not spending as much time on the business as you are in the business. But when you do have those opportunities to spend on the business, how are you utilizing that time? And the easiest way to get to the answer of that question is to, again, look at the mission, look at the goal, and then go backwards and say, okay, what are the steps that I could take right now immediately that would help me get there? And then elaborate on it. I mean, I'm a huge fan of task boards. Chris and I both use task boards pretty religiously, and I love to say, okay, big goal, big initiative, we'll call it. So establish, I don't know, maybe like get a new CRM developed or something like that. All right. New CRM get developed. That's still a pretty far-reaching goal. I can't just it's not like I'm just going to like clock in one day and get the new CRM developed. There's going to be multiple steps that I have to take in order to be able to get there. So what are those steps? Okay, well, I probably need to reach out to the CRM provider. I need to interview with 3 or 4 and find out which one's the best fit for me. And then once I agree to it, I need to make sure it's in alignment with my budget. Once I make sure of that, I need to put the credit card in and get all that set up. And then I need to start building out the catalog and doing the whole transition process and migrate my old stuff into it. And like those are the examples of where you look at that goal, you look at that vision that you have. Because I know, unfortunately, so many people do this where they do not dissect it. And what they get to is they get to a point where like, okay, I can't tell you how many times, especially when I first started my company, this was me. The first 3 years of my company's existence was a lot of vision and very, very little action, especially at the granular level. So what I would do is I would say, okay, I'm a $150,000 revenue my first year. And then I'm like, okay, I want to do 500,000 my second year. But I just continued doing the same exact things that I did that got me to 150,000. So I mean, I still grew because I was a brand new company, and brand new companies just historically tend to grow pretty, especially if the person's just at the very least just showing up. But I was still acting like a $150,000 company trying to be a $500,000 company, and that it didn't line up. That's kind of a whole nother topic in itself to some degree, because you're talking about, are you behaving like you're actually the goal that you want to be? Like, are you behaving like that type of company? Because if you're let's just say you're a $1 million company, and next year you want to be a $3 million company. You've probably heard the thing like act like what you want to be, and it will happen. It's like, yeah, that's true. I think a lot of people hear that and they're like, okay, but in reality, I'm still not a $3 million company. But also in reality, I mean, if you're a $1 million company in 2024 and you step to become you're like, by the end of 2025, you have sold $3 million of revenue at the end of the year. My opinion is that on January 1st, you were operating as a $3 million company, because at the end of 2025, the entire year of 2025, you were a $3 million company because you did $3 million in revenue. So day one should equal the behavior of a $3 million company in the same way that day 365 also should.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, and like you said, that's a whole different topic, but I totally agree. I mean, I think there's so much to be said about looking at where you want to be and then doing the things now that are going to need to be done when you get there and just doing them now. I mean, it goes back to the classic expression, like, what the way that you act, the way that you see see your reality, it will become what your reality is. I mean, yeah, that's a rabbit hole. But I would definitely say that that is a huge, huge, huge thing when you're talking about setting goals, because I feel like a lot of people are so nervous about setting lofty, difficult, challenging goals. And I think what it really comes down to is, I think that it comes down to that expression of like, shoot for the stars and you'll hit the moon. It's not that you're going to pick a goal that's so unattainable and so ridiculous that you can't get there. But if you set a goal that is a stretch, like, it's a little bit pushing what you realistically think is possible. Like, if you think that, like, hey, realistically, if I grow to this size, I could do $800,000 in revenue. Setting a goal of doing 1 million is not that unattainable. But if you're currently a $100,000 a year company and you want to grow to 5 million, the chances of that happening in one calendar year are very slim, at least in the home service space. I mean, if you're selling e-commerce or some crap, then yeah, whatever. You can set your own goals based on how crazy you want to get. But at least in the home service space, I would say that it's you got to look at the data, look at the numbers like we talked about in the beginning. But setting a goal that's a little bit of a stretch or a little bit unattainable is not a bad idea. It pushes you to be just that little bit of extra, and that little bit of extra growth. And you just might be surprised you might get there.
Yeah, and I think that would be my closing statement on all of this would be, identify what your fear is, because one of the biggest things you don't want to do is lead this vision by fear. And fear, what that would look like is, I want to be I don't know, let's just say 100,000 to 500,000. Okay, so I want to go from 100 to 500. In order to be able to do that, like, what are you afraid of? What are the things that, if there's a stretch goal that you've established for yourself, at what point because I'm of the opinion that there's an intersect where fear and reality split, because reality could be maybe a $750,000 goal. Like, you have to work your tail off to make that happen, but like, it's actually possible if you were diligent and did the right things. Fear might kick in right around, I don't know, let's just say fear starts to kick in around 500,000, because fear tells you, okay, because of my history, I am not the type of person, or I haven't been able to build the type of business that could even be that big. Like, I have no idea how I would get there. I would have to do this and this and this. And it's like, okay, well, do those things. Like, don't run from the potential failure of reaching that goal. But at the same time, be reasonable and realistic enough to identify that. But is there a point where fear is undercutting what possible reality might be? Because I think a lot of times we do that to ourselves. And in my opinion, it's one of the most damaging things you can do, because it just is going to stunt your own ability to be your best version of yourself.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. And I think, kind of on that note, we're about ready to wrap up. But I think at the end of the day, one of the things you have to remember is that usually, for most people, the results and accomplishments and goals that you have are hidden right in front of you, inside that fear, nervousness, and work that you don't want to do. Usually, if you start thinking about your goals and you start thinking about where you want to be, most of the time, the things that you're like, oh man, I really don't want to do that, that's what you have to do. Like 90% of the time. And when you start thinking about this and you start planning your year and you start thinking about where you want to be in the next year, pay close attention to that gut reaction of like, ooh, that's a little bit scary. Ooh, that's a little bit hard to do. ooh, that's not really going to work. I don't know how the heck I'm going to do that. Like those things that give you that reaction, I can't explain why, but those things are usually what needs to be done to get to where you want to be. Like 99.999% of the time. It's very rarely the easy thing that is going to get you to where you want to be. The future that you want is usually hidden in the work that you don't want to do. Very, very often. Well, I think we got to wrap up. Ben, any last comments, statements, questions, comments, concerns?
No, man. I mean, that's good what you just said, and I agree entirely. I mean, I think goal planning is not an easy task. It's not a painfully difficult task either, but I think it's an extremely necessary one. So take the action steps. I mean, there's a lot that you can do. There's a lot of different goal planning methods. At the end of the day, this is kind of the advice I would give to most people, but if you're feeling overwhelmed by starting, then just start. Just start with a pen and paper if that's all you can do, or if you want to go down the rabbit hole and establish like a complete vision board and identify every single little piece of that, like go for it. But it's not an easy journey, but it's a really necessary one. So please do it. And if there's any sense of doubt or questions or just complete uncertainty, reach out to us, and we want to be here for you to be able to help you walk through it.
Yep. We would love to see y'all. We really appreciate you guys listening to this, tuning in, and sticking around this long. For those of you that don't know, we are on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're on every other major podcast platform that exists except for Samsung Podcast, because apparently Samsung Podcast isn't going to exist in a couple of weeks. Sorry to all you guys that use that. If you're currently using that, just get a Spotify account like the rest of the 21st. We are also on YouTube. Video version of this podcast is on YouTube. And most importantly, we are on Skool. Skool. If you don't know what Skool is, if you're a new listener, first time, or you are tuning in and haven't checked it out before, Skool is an online community platform that we operate a group on that we use to connect with people. So if you'd like to connect with us, connect with other entrepreneurs and other business owners that are starting or growing companies, and you'd like to hang out with some like-minded people, check us out on Skool. The link will be in the show notes. It is completely free. We don't charge. We don't make you sign up for anything. You just have to create an account and join our group, and you can jump into our community and hang out with us. We post content there. We post our podcasts and episodes there, and then we do discussions, and we're working on courses and classes to be there as well. We would love to see you guys there. And on that note, much appreciated, and we'll see you guys on the next one.